The wind howled outside. It was a cold November day. John sat in his car, hands shaking. He didn't want to go in, but he had to. He had to tell someone. John took a deep breath. He opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. The sheriff's station looked old and grim. The paint was peeling, the sign creaked in the wind. John walked towards the station, each step heavy with dread. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of old coffee and dust. John looked around the small, cramped office. A lone figure sat behind a desk piled high with papers. The man behind the desk looked up. He had a kind face, but his eyes were sharp. "Sheriff? You John?" His voice was deep and gravelly. John nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He walked slowly towards the desk, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sheriff, sit down, son. Tell me what happened." John took a shaky breath and began to speak. His words tumbled out in a rush, his voice trembling. He told the sheriff about the strange lights he'd seen in the woods, the unearthly sounds he'd heard. The sheriff listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't question. His silence was unnerving. When John finished, there was a long silence. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on John's face. "Sheriff, you sure about what you saw, son?" he finally asked, his voice low. Section 4. A noise in the back. John swallowed hard. "Yes, Sheriff," he whispered. "I know what I saw." As he spoke, a strange scratching sound came from the back room. It was faint but unmistakable. John's blood ran cold. He glanced nervously towards the sound. The sheriff seemed to notice his unease. He stood up, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Wait here," he instructed, his voice firm. He walked slowly towards the back room, his hand never leaving his holster. Section 5. A glimpse of something. John watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. The scratching sound continued, now louder, more insistent. He strained to hear, his senses on high alert. Suddenly, the sheriff let out a startled yell. It was cut short abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. John's breath caught in his throat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He crept closer to the back room, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open a fraction. Section 6. Escape. The back room was dark, lit only by a single flickering bulb, and then he saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, stood over something on the floor. John's blood ran cold. He couldn't make out the figure's face, but he could see its eyes. They glowed with an unnatural light. John knew he had to get out. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the figure moving behind him, its heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway. He didn't dare look back. He threw open the office door and stumbled out into the night, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling his ears. He had to get help, had to tell someone what he'd seen. But who would believe him?